and some of the causes. So my presentation will be broken down into 5 parts, and I've listed them here. I'll start with the purpose of this presentation. I've already given you a hint, and I will also give you my bottom line as well. What is my ultimate conclusion? I think in order to understand where the difficulties of the WTO are at the moment, you need to understand a lot about the global context and how it's changed a lot since 1995 when the WTO was created. In fact, the 20 years of difference, I think, explains a lot about why this organization might not be in the place it should be. Then I'm going to turn from the discussion of the context and how it's changed, that's the context in which the WTO operates, to how it's actually performed in 3 of its major functions in the area of negotiations, dispute settlement, and monitoring and deliberation. And here I'm going to argue that the WTO has underperformed. I will give you numerous examples. Then I will turn to some of the arguments which you're probably going to hear this year, which will be used to try and defend the WTO. And I'm going to point to some of their weaknesses to almost prime you on that. Because there will be a number of people who, quite frankly, cannot accept the factual record I'm going to describe, and will either try to shift the issue, deny the issue, or evade. And you'll see that, and I'll anticipate a few of those comments. And lastly, I'll turn to an overall assessment of the WTO and where I think it's going. So that's the plan for this particular presentation, and I hope to leave plenty of time for you to ask me difficult questions at the end, especially if you disagree with anything or all of what I say. So the presentation that I have here has the following purpose, and I've listed it here. Bearing in mind the changing global context, and I do mean that, that's not just one of those nice introductory comments you put at the beginning, because I do think the global context has changed a lot, and I'll show you why later. The purpose of this presentation is to assess on a function-by-function basis the performance of the WTO, and to really ask how well is it doing. And since I'm going to argue that the answer to that is not so well, we need to ask why, and then what can we learn from that? Because I think especially the last 5 to 10 years have been very tough on the WTO, very, very tough on the WTO. And so the question you might want to ask as the WTO turns 20 is that will its middle age be more settled than its adolescence? And as we know, most people's adolescences are not so easy. So hopefully, we often hope that people's life in their 20s and 30s is a little better than their teenage years. And maybe what we have is just a little bit of growing up trouble, which we can get over, or maybe it's more fundamental, in which case we need to think hard about how to fix it. Now, I will start with a confession, which is that for the first 10 years of the WTO's existence, I was a firm, sort of unwavering believer. So in terms of characterizing my views on this, would probably be part of what you might call the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil crowd. If you know this analogy with the 3 monkeys, and it's a way of saying that, if you're loyal to an institution almost to a fault, okay? And I would certainly put it there. I think I co-authored the World Bank's most pro-WTO document ever in 1999 when I was a government official there. Sorry, when I was an official at the World Bank. And it was so pro the WTO that many of my trade colleagues objected to it on the grounds that I was being too favorable. So this gives you a sense of how far, at least my views on this subject, have changed. Now, what I would argue is that since 1995, especially since 2005, there has been an accumulation of evidence which has changed my view. And what I will do is explain why, and you may look at the evidence differently from me, you may disagree about its implications, but then we should at least talk about that. And for those of you who are going to do the course with me, we have a whole week to talk about that, so amongst other things. So I want to start off by saying that I'm very much a supporter of the idea of international trade rules and of the stability and the predictability that they bring. But when a system is going not so well, I think we have to be open and discuss this. Now, the reason I raise that is that there's going to be amongst, I think, a number of analysts this year, a lot of very well-intentioned people who will downplay their criticisms of the WTO because they do not want to be seen to be supporting critics of the WTO. And this really begs the following question, which I'll end on in my talk, which is, who are the better friends of the WTO? The ones who hide the problems or the ones who discuss them openly? And it's clear which camp I stand in. But there will be this tendency, I think, this year, especially among senior officials and ministers, to downplay the problems, okay, and say that everything is fine. And we know for sure that everything isn't fine. If you read the fine print of the G20 leaders' commitments or statements at Brisbane last year, they have very subtly put in a sentence saying that they want to have a discussion at next year's G20 Leaders Summit about the performance of the WTO. They didn't say that it was going badly. They didn't say it's a massive problem that needs to be fixed. But they said they wanted to have a discussion about where the system is going. Now, you don't put commitments like this and communicates like that unless someone is concerned. And I think amongst the more higher levels of government, there is a concern, but nobody really knows how to talk about it. And maybe they don't even know what all the problems are. And hopefully I will contribute to that discussion with this presentation. So, that's the context. You know what I want to do, you know what my bottom line is going to be, and you know where I'm coming from. Let's turn then to ultimately to summarize my findings. And really, the subtitle, Trouble in Paradise, says it all. Paradise because we do think the WTO on net is a good thing, okay? But the problem has been that in many respects, too many people have oversold the WTO. They put it on a pedestal. And this, I think, has been a problem because the moment the problems have arisen, they've been unable to talk about that honestly. Trouble, because I do think the last 5 to 10 years have been good for the WTO. Cumulatively, and I'll show you that. Lastly, paradise in the sense that we do want, the world is probably better off with the WTO. It would probably be better off if we had a stronger WTO. But we haven't got it yet, and maybe we can talk about whether we will. And that really begs the ultimate underlying question, which is that the WTO was created to much fanfare to be a strong institution. It's become a lot weaker institution, and the question we have to ask is, since the WTO's members are governments, will there be circumstances when those governments want to see a stronger institution again? Because I think a number of governments, for very different reasons, have progressively weakened the WTO and have walked away from the WTO. And the interesting then question is whether they're going to come back and try and support the WTO and under what circumstances, and maybe we can find those circumstances. A related point is that you have to think about what is it that the WTO does. The WTO is involved, in practical terms, the WTO is about negotiating legally binding agreements, where governments normally say, I give up the right to do this. Okay? And if governments are going to use the WTO, really they're saying that they find that way of negotiating agreements and that type of agreement useful. And the interesting question is how many of the major economic powers still find legally binding accords useful for them. And so the question I really put here at the bottom, are big players really prepared to bind, that is to tie their hands, on first order economic policies like competition policy, which we'll talk about in the course and which has been important. Are governments really prepared to do this? And I must say, over time, when I look at the WTO negotiations and when I look at many regional trading agreements, I increasingly come to the answer, no, they're not. Well, if you don't see the value of binding accords on major economic policies, then the principal instrument we have at the WTO loses a lot of its force. And then the organization loses a lot of its value as well. And so you can see how I'm beginning to develop an argument as to what's going wrong here. And I think ultimately, it's not that the WTO has changed too much. It's probably that the member states who are members of the WTO want different things than what they wanted in the year 1995 when the WTO was created. So the world has moved on, and the interesting question then is, can the WTO? Well, since I raised the issue of the world, let's talk about the world. Let's talk about the changing global context, which I think is absolutely central to the story. Okay. The first feature of the global context, changing global context, is that compared to 1995, the world trading system is very, very different. In 1995, there were three major features. The Americans were on the ascendant, the Russians and the communists were on the way down, they had been vanquished, and the Europeans were still important. Okay? So that was the context. No one talked about India, China, the BRICS, no one talked about the emerging markets. And so this was a system which was created at a very special time where there was only one way of doing business, the Anglo-Saxon way of doing business, and the communist way of doing business had been discredited. Europe's weaknesses were not too clear at that stage, so they were seen as still strong members in the system, and this system was built at that time. What has happened since then, and as these charts from the economists show, is that we had 15, what the economists call glorious years. Okay, 15 amazing years of emerging market growth, where income per head, classic driver of living standards, grew very fast in the emerging markets. Now that period of growth, which went from maybe 1995 onwards, maybe 2000 onwards to 2014, that period of growth is now coming to an end, which is interesting. Looking forward, it would have interesting implications for where the system goes. But we had an enormous period of catch-up, driven largely by Chinese growth and the knock-on consequences from that. But there was also a period in the middle part of the last decade when India was growing very fast as well. We should not forget that. We should not also forget that the least developed countries saw their trade grow very fast during the last decade, about 16% a year in real terms, phenomenal growth really, and many other emerging markets did well. So we now have, you've heard the phrase before, a multipolar world, but that multipolar world came on the back of substantial economic growth. Whether that convergence continues in the future is an interesting point. So we had then the rise of key emerging markets, which then made India, China, Brazil important players in Geneva, in the WTO. Now, looking forward, what's interesting is that amongst the developing countries, we are seeing a huge divergence in growth patterns. We are seeing, on average, growth in the emerging markets in blue decline a little bit. Okay? So their economic growth, on average, in the emerging markets is going from 5 to 6% a year, now down to about 3 to 4%. So that's the growth slowdown into that in the last chart. But what we have in red is what's the standard deviation, the variability across emerging markets in those growth rates. And the most interesting thing about the post-crisis period is the huge jump in variability amongst emerging markets. And so one feature we will see in emerging markets going forward is that emerging markets are going to become a very differentiated group. Some will be growing very fast, some will be growing much slower. This is going to have, I think, big implications for their willingness to engage in trade reforms. So we will not just have the traditional north-south splits that we've seen, but we see south-south splits as well. By the way, we also see north-north splits as well. So this is going to be a much more fractured and fragmented global trading system than the one we had in 1995. And this may explain why people can't get along, countries can't agree. And they have very different alternate circumstances. So that's the first important point about underlying growth patterns. The second is that what we've seen with the global economic crisis was a huge collapse in exports. On the left-hand side here, we saw for some countries exports fall by almost 50%. And then on the right-hand side, with the recovery, we've seen a very different pattern. Now, after the last big recession in the early 2000s, after the dot-com boom, we saw a very interesting regularity, which was that every time the world's GDP went up by 1%, world trade went up by 2%. And this is about the closest you can get to a regularity for an economist. An economist sees this and looks at the predictability of this and suddenly gets excited, right? Because, wow, there's something here to explain. So that was what we saw during the last boom, a 2-for-1 relationship. Every time world growth went up by 1%, world trade went up by 2%. After the great trade collapse in 2009, we first saw a ratio which was greater than 2 to 1. So everybody thought, look, globalization is back on track, right? Trade is growing faster than GDP. This is great news. What we've seen subsequently, however, is now that this ratio is back to 1-to-1, and it seems to be stuck at 1-to-1. So some people are calling this a trade slowdown, because if trade is just growing as fast as GDP, that means in most countries, exports to GDP ratios will be constant. Trade is no longer the driver of growth that it has been in many countries, including in Malaysia. So this has been one big change. Now, when these graphs started coming out, I started checking how is this playing out for different types of countries. Well, here's the answer. So what I did was to calculate for different groups of countries, what's that ratio of how much their exports have gone up by how much world GDP went up by. Remember that in the last decade, of the world, the ratio was around 2. In fact, it was actually 2.21 if you did the period before the last crisis. Since the crisis has happened, and taking out 2009, which was a really bad year, you don't like to distort the numbers, the ratio has fallen at the world level. But then what I also did was to calculate these so-called ratios, or elasticities as we economists call them, for the least developed countries, the lower middle income countries, and the OECD countries. For the OECD countries, not much change. Now, what's really interesting is for the poorer countries. For the least developed countries, before the crisis happened, every time world GDP went up 1%, their exports went up almost 10%. Enormous export growth in the LDCs. That has collapsed from 10 down to 3.5. So this group of countries who are in, these are countries in bad shape because they're not normally very well off. They don't have any resources, and trade has been this big engine of growth. This growth engine has really come into problems. For the lower middle income countries, so this would be your Indias of the world, you see almost halving there or there of that ratio. So something fundamentally is changing in world trade dynamics, which is going to make, for many trade ministers, for many governments, for many prime ministers, exports seem a lot less attractive means of driving growth. And if that's the case, they're going to find negotiating trade agreements less attractive, and they're going to be much more skeptical about paying any political cost to get trade negotiations going. So I think this is the second big change that we've seen. We've seen a big change in the underlying growth dynamics from before the crisis and after the crisis. So that's the second big change. The third big change that we've seen is a return of protectionism, especially during the crisis era. Now, this data comes from the Global Trade Alert. I should make a declaration here. I organise the Global Trade Alert. So this is what the data my team collects. And this data is far more negative and pessimistic than what you get out of the WTO Secretariat, which monitors protectionism very differently. And what we have tried to do here is show quarter by quarter what protectionism, what new protectionism is being implemented. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, until our latest report, it was possible to argue that protectionism spiked in 2009, the first quarter of 2009, and then was under control. So worldwide, you could look at this data and turn around and say, look, there was a problem in the crisis in 2009, but it got fixed. Somehow it got fixed. Maybe the WTO works. That's the conclusion some people draw from this. Well, in the last year, a year and a half actually, my team has worked very, very hard. We've documented another 2,000 policy changes, and the new data looks very different. What we see instead is 3 phases of protectionism. A spike in 2009, when the global economy was really doing badly. Then as the global economy starts, the prospects start improving, the protectionism stabilizes. By the way, it never falls back to the level that we saw before the crisis. It stabilizes at a high level. Remember, these are new protectionist measures, so this is additional protectionism. And then, once global economic prospects start getting worse in 2012 and 13, when Europe looks like it's in bad shape, the Americans look like they're in bad shape, the Chinese look more, things look more worrying for them, then protectionism starts picking up again. And these lower numbers here aren't good news, they just reflect the fact that it takes time to collect data on protectionism. And already our totals for these quarters are beginning to rise higher and higher. So what we see is actually three phases of protectionism. A period when the world economy was very worried and when protectionism was high. This was in 2009. This is the period when G20 leaders took protectionism seriously, at least rhetorically. Then when things got better, everybody said, oh, protectionism's under control. In fact, actually, it hadn't gone back to its previous levels. And then what's happened, this is very worrying, is that protectionism is now back at the old 2009 levels, but no one's talking about it. Well, not everyone's not talking about it. At the G20 summit, Mrs. Merkel, the German Chancellor, told her fellow leaders that she was very worried about creeping protectionism. Okay, so one of the Sherpas reported this from there. And I think at the most senior levels, they do know what's going on. They do know that the numbers are pointing to more protectionism, but in polite conversation, you can't talk about it. Right? And I think this is the third feature which is undermining the system, especially since the WTO Secretariat has foolishly got around telling everybody that they've conquered protectionism and that they're on top of it. The answer is they're not. And enough people know about it, and this is undermining their credibility. So that's the third development, which is worrying. Now, since we're in Malaysia, I decided to do a little bit of extra research and find out which foreign countries have been targeting protectionism at Malaysian commercial interests. So you can find out who's been awful towards Malaysia and what measures have they been doing. Well, here's the data, and I dug up this data in the last day. Since November 2008, we have seen, on the left-hand side, we have seen over 200 tariff increases around the world, which have hurt Malaysian interests. We have seen the imposition of 135 subsidies, which have competed which involve products which compete directly with Malaysian exporters, and we've seen 76 anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures taken against Malaysia. In total, there's 601 protectionist policy instruments which have been taken against Malaysian commercial interests since this crisis began. Okay? Now, who's been doing it? So who are the bad guys? Well, they're on the right-hand side here. Okay, so the biggest bad guy of all, India. The country which always tells you they're the biggest supporter of developing countries. They're no friend of Malaysia when it comes to protectionism. Okay? So the Indians have done a lot. Then Indonesia, right next door. Indonesia has gone on a huge craze of protectionism in the last 5 years, and it shows up in the data. Argentina, no free trader there, another 10%. The EU and all the member states together have done 54 measures, and China has done 52 measures as well. So if you add this all together, you find out that essentially India, Indonesia, Argentina, the EU, and China, 5 trading partners, are responsible for over half of the protectionism which hurts Malaysia. The question we have to ask is, what can Malaysia do about this given the WTO? Or, to put it differently, being a member of the WTO has not stopped Malaysia being hurt by all this protectionism. And what's happening is I think more and more people are understanding this and looking at it with respect to their own countries. By the way, all of this data is freely available on a website which we run with the Global Trade Alert. And many governments go along and they check what's happening to their country. I know because I get the report from the website provider on who's using our data, okay, which cities are downloading the data, and we know that governments are checking. Okay, and you can see here that Malaysia has not been unaffected by protectionism. So you can see that this should make you worried at just how much, or make you wonder just how much protection Malaysia is getting from protectionism, and the answer might be less than you think. Now, those are the 3 features which are 3 bad features which we've seen, or 3 big changes we've seen. We've also seen some positive developments. We've seen a lot of tariff cutting by the BRICS, okay, especially by Brazil, China, and India, the Russian Federation less so. And but this is important because it suggests there's a lot of trade reform which is taking place outside of the WTO. So, and this is one of the most important things to remember when you study the WTO, is that countries can do things outside of the WTO. They don't have to wait for a negotiation to be concluded. And of course, the other big development, which is creating a lot of discussion, and which we'll talk about in the course, is that since it's so hard to negotiate things at the WTO, many of the big players have now decided they want to negotiate free trade agreements between themselves. EU and Japan, EU and the United States, the US and its partners in the Asia Pacific, and the Chinese and their reset initiative, which they have tried to develop as well. And so this represents what some people call competitive liberalization, and the logic is as follows, that by negotiating more and more free trade agreements amongst themselves, that the parties who are outside those agreements become more nervous that they are excluded, and that they will go running to Geneva and offer to do business at the WTO. So if you're sitting in Washington, you sit there and say, look, doing business in Geneva at the moment is just too difficult. We can't get these developing countries to agree to anything. They're being too difficult. Let's negotiate free trade agreements with enough other parties so that the countries which are excluded from those free trade agreements soften their position in Geneva and become more cooperative. And that is the strategy which the Americans and to some degree the Europeans are playing as well. And so this is creating an insider-outsider dynamic where you're either inside these negotiations, like TPP, or you're outside. Okay? And this, of course, has implications for countries' commercial interests, such as Malaysia as well. So the global context overall, then, is one which is very different from 1995. We have a lot of big new players, the big emerging markets. We had a profound economic shock, the global economic crisis, and I do think the world trade is different after the crisis than before the crisis. We've seen a return to protectionism. We've seen that return to protectionism happen despite all of the machinery of the WTO, which is important to remember. We see some countries undertaking unilateral trade reforms, especially developing countries outside of the WTO. They're not waiting for the WTO. And then we've got the big players of the WTO, the old big players of the WTO, who have decided to give up on negotiating there and negotiate free trade agreements amongst themselves. So this is the context in which the series of failures that I'm about to now describe to you are occurring. Okay? And I think once you see this context, it's not hard to see the failure that I'm going to be describing in terms of the WTO's functions. Well, I'm going to talk about the performance of the WTO's three core functions. That is its negotiation function, the negotiation of new agreements, its dispute settlement function, so how it deals with trade conflicts, and also the monitoring of government behavior that the WTO does, and the deliberation, that is the discussions which are supposed to be based on that information. Now these are the three traditional functions of the WTO, and this will be what most people will discuss. I should add that in preparing this presentation, I almost added a fourth function, which is the accession function of the WTO. That is the part of the WTO which deals with the terms upon which countries join the WTO. I would argue there the record is equally bad as well. Okay? And I think it's an area which is not studied particularly well. But still, I'll stick to the traditional three functions of the WTO. Let's start with the negotiating function. Now here, the record has been bad. Very little new and substantial has been accomplished. Now it's a great shame that the High Commissioner for Singapore is no longer with us, because he would recognize that in the first few years of the WTO, there was an enormous fight amongst the WTO members about implementing the rules of intellectual property rights, which were agreed in the Uruguay round. And I would describe that fight as nothing more than a guerrilla war, where essentially the West got a series of rules that it wanted, and then once emerging markets, developing countries, realized what those rules meant, they said, quite frankly, excuse my language, go to hell. No way in hell are we going to tolerate this. And this began essentially a series of negotiations about how to renegotiate a trade deal. This, by the way, is your first warning of something I'm going to come back to later, which is that although trade officials, ambassadors, ministers talk about trade agreements being signed and lasting forever, they don't necessarily have to. Okay? agreements last for as long as people want them to last. Okay? And this is the first sign here of what I say, what you signed in Marrakesh at the Uruguay round conclusion isn't necessarily what happened going forward. Right? Deals get renegotiated, and one of the first things that happened at the WTO was not that we were going to negotiate new agreements, it was actually negotiating how to weaken old ones. Okay? So if anything, that was the system going backwards, not forwards. The second big problem was with the launch of the Doha round and its subsequent impasse, the fact that it was not resolved. I'll spend a bit more time talking about why that was on the next slide. The third area where negotiations took place was in the area of trade facilitation. And you may recall in the run-up to the 2013 Imperial Conference, the WTO members were able to agree a trade facilitation deal. That's a deal to speed up the processing of imports and exports through customs houses. And then last year, India repudiated the deal. And then they had to negotiate India away from that particular position. And it's important to remember that after 20 years of existence then, the WTO managed to negotiate a deal which was exceptionally small, a very weak deal, which then got repudiated and now is only just back on the table. This is not much to show for 20 years worth of work. And the process associated with that negotiation was so painful that I think it reinforced the impression in minds of some people that doing business at the WTO in terms of negotiation is not feasible. The last thing that was negotiated was the revision to the government procurement agreement, which was a plurilateral agreement. That's agreements which countries voluntarily join, and this has been revised, and this is held up as a great success. But what most people don't forget, and maybe this is just reflecting my age, is that when this agreement was first signed, it was regarded as a very, very bad agreement. So really all they've done is to fix a bad agreement. Okay? And I cite this book in 1997, which actually I contributed towards. And it was shocking reading even how people who were supporters of the WTO recognized this was not a very successful deal, not a very popular deal. And what they managed to do in the last 5 years was to fix that 15 years later. And I think what we have then is a track record of underperformance. Now, what's the problem here? I think the problem is that we lived in the shadow of the Uruguay round. For those of you who are too young to remember or were doing other things, or maybe not even with us at that time, the Uruguay round was an extremely aggressive and ambitious negotiation, where the goal was to try and put all WTO members on the same level, create a new organization called the WTO, and to have far-reaching trade reform. And this mindset of what trade deals are supposed to be like is the mindset still of most of the ambassadors in Geneva from Western countries, and from some of the richer emerging markets. So this cohort of ambassadors grew up negotiating the Uruguay round. This was how they learned their subject. They learned that that's what trade deals are. The problem is that this time around in the Doha round, many countries didn't want to liberalize. And at least in the context of the WTO, many countries were more happy to liberalize unilaterally than multilaterally. And so this mindset, which was that we use trade agreements in Geneva to cut trade barriers, was one which didn't find much support. In fact, if you go back in history at the GATT, which was the predecessor to the WTO, multilateral trade deals then were not about agreeing to cut new trade barriers. It was about codifying, putting on paper, all of the trade tariff reform that countries had done themselves previously. So the role of trade deals has changed from being one of locking in what countries had already agreed to do voluntarily to forcing them to do new things, or at least encouraging them to do new things. And this is a very big switch in modus, in operation, and I think it's one which might have worked in the Uruguay round and certainly doesn't work now. So this is why I have this question: have the Uruguay round walked how many WTO deals? Is their expectations of the WTO wrong, or at least not reflective of circumstances today? And the last factor which has really affected the negotiation of trade deals is that as we move from tariffs to negotiating about regulations, the interest and the logic associated with those types of negotiations is just fundamentally different. And it turns out that instead of deals where you agree to cut your tariffs and I agree to cut mine, or you agree to codify your tariff cuts and I agree to codify mine, deals about our nation's regulations involve more players and are more difficult to agree to, not least because we want different things from our regulations. The Americans want different things from their competition law than the Europeans do. So it's no wonder that they can't agree on multilateral rules in this area. So I think these are the underlying reasons. Now, this is important because remember I gave you a hint earlier as to why I think the fundamental problem is. At the WTO, the principal instrument is negotiating legally binding agreements. If people don't see the value of those legally binding agreements or see the value of legally binding legal obligations of that nature, then there is not much of a negotiating function to do at the WTO. Okay? And I think what's happened is how people have seen the value of binding accords has changed, and that's really underlying the failure. When it comes to the Doha round impasse, there's a lot of reasons why this happened. I have a whole paper on it, which I've cited here. I would argue, just to put it in a nutshell, there's no one single cause. I would also argue that it was not predestined to fail. I think events happened after the negotiations started, which no one could have anticipated, which became important, like the global economic crisis. And there are also events which no one thought about the consequences of, like all this unilateral trade reform, which countries were not prepared to codify, or at least, or if they were prepared to codify, they weren't prepared to do so on the terms which other countries offered. So there's a whole list of reasons as to why the Doha round failed. I would just refer you to the paper. One of the interesting twists in the discussion about this is that in the last few years, the blame game as to why the Doha round failed has a new target. In the old days, you used to blame either the Europeans or the Americans. One of those two was always the bad guys. And since the Europeans and the Americans don't find it convenient to blame each other anymore, they have to blame someone else. So now the bad guy is China. Okay? And one of the things which those of you who follow this, who plan on following this area closely over time, is be very careful about which blame game you believe, because these are often very deliberately constructed arguments. And so the blame game at the moment is to say that the Chinese aren't offering anything, and that's why the deal is failed. Of course, the Chinese gave up a lot to get into the WTO in the first place, and this is conveniently forgotten. All right, so that's the first function which I think has gone very badly wrong, which is negotiation. The second function, which is going badly wrong, is dispute settlement. Now, the fact that the Doha round and the negotiation function have gone wrong, I don't think anyone seriously disputes. It's awkward, it's unfortunate. This topic I want to talk about now, dispute settlement, this will make me a lot of enemies. Because the argument made by many of our friends who support the WTO is, okay, the negotiation function's having a bit of trouble, but we've still got dispute settlement. And the international trade lawyers who love this system, of course, why wouldn't they? They make lots of money from it. They call this the jewel in the crown. Well, I would argue that the jewel in the crown has got a few problems as well. And the first, and perhaps the first big sign that there's something wrong, is that very few people are using this system. Despite all the protectionism that I've shown you, all the breaking of the rules, the fact that more and more countries have legal representation and can bring cases, fewer and fewer cases are being brought. Why? Because everything's going so well? Because no one's breaking the rules? No. I think there are structural reasons why this system is not being used that much. And let me turn to them, because I think this is the real reason. Okay? Now, the real reasons are fourfold. The first is that very quickly, American business realized that the dispute settlement understanding was useful for bringing cases, but didn't necessarily get rid of the foreign trade barriers that they saw. And so there were a number of cases in the middle of the 90s which were brought by American commercial interests where the goal was to remove a foreign trade barrier, and the dispute didn't work out that way. The system didn't deliver the objective of the American commercial interests. And many American business lobbies and business associations at that time began to have second thoughts about the WTO. And for those of you who will follow this business carefully over years, it's always worth following the Americans because they do their homework. They're not like Europeans and other countries where they sit back and talk nicely about principles. The Americans look at hard facts and outcomes and they inform themselves and they get the stuff done. You may not agree with them, but you can't dispute the fact that the Americans do their homework. And I think the American business community very quickly realized this system was not delivering the removal of the trade barriers that it wanted. Now, of course, in the WTO dispute settlement understanding, if a country just loses a case and they don't remove their trade barrier, they can be hit by sanctions. But what use is that to an American business that wants to get rid of the original trade barrier? If you're an American cattle bureau and you want to sell hormone-treated beef in Europe, and the Europeans refuse to get rid of hormone-treated beef and are prepared to take the sanctions as the punishment, that doesn't help you with your cows in the middle of the western states, mountain western states. That doesn't help you sell a single extra cow in Europe. And it's practical considerations like this, not high theory, practical considerations which dealt the first blow to the system. The second is that we are beginning to see more and more governments who bring cases against each other settle those cases in inappropriate ways. The whole point of using the system is to bring cases so that the country if a country's broken the rules, they are supposed to, supposed to remove them ultimately. What we have now, is a series of examples which I have documented recently with a colleague in which countries have brought cases against each other and settled them without removing the underlying commercial policy problem. So to give you an example, America and Indonesia had a series of disputes where instead of getting rid of their the problems which created those disputes, they just agreed to ignore each other's problems. This is not the proper solution to the problem. Okay? This is an abuse of the settlement process. The third problem we're seeing is that if countries, even before countries bring cases, some countries are probably sitting there thinking, well, look, if I bring a case against another country, that other country is going to look up what I've been doing and bring a case against me. Or retaliate. Now in English we have this lovely expression, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. And I think we're seeing that as a reason why we're seeing less and less cases being brought as well. The fourth reason, which no one will talk about publicly, but which is true, is that even though we have a small number of cases, look how the cases are falling in terms of averages, the WTO Secretariat is overwhelmed by them. And that's really because in this current system, it turns out that the people doing all the hard work in the dispute settlement process is the WTO Secretariat. It's not the judges who are sitting on these panels, it's the Secretariat officials who advise these panels. They're the ones doing all the hard work, doing the research, doing all the writing, and they're getting overwhelmed. And now what's happened is that we have the pressure on the Secretariat is so intense that when countries say they want to bring cases against another country, the WTO Secretariat is often informally asking them to delay bringing cases. Right? And so there's an old expression here which goes back over 2,000 years. It's actually the first recorded use of it is in Jewish scripture, but it's used in many countries' literature. Justice delayed is justice denied. And that's exactly what we're seeing here as well. So I would argue that counter to the public international lawyers that you hear and many of the supporters of the WTO, that the dispute settlement system has much less bite than it is said. And that this is a system which I think is underperforming. Let's turn now to the third function of the WTO, which is monitoring and deliberation. Here, this has been, I would argue, a mess. This has not worked at all well. I'll give you 3 examples. First, there are many agreements in the WTO where governments are supposed to notify their policies to the Secretariat. And there are big gaps in this. There are many areas where countries are just not notifying as they should. countries are breaking their obligations doing this, but no one seems to punish them for not doing this. And you must understand, in this business, if you don't have high quality information, it's very hard to complain about what another country's doing. Because the first thing the ambassador from the other country will do is say, where are your facts? Information in this business is power. Okay? And governments do take a lot of actions to deny information to other governments. Okay? And one of the ways they do this is by not notifying their policies to the WTO. Second, on the deliberation side, there were 4 working groups set up on the Singapore issues, and these were supposed to encourage serious deliberation about whether or not to have negotiations on these topics, and quite frankly, on reflection, looking back at how these working groups work, they were a travesty. And for the simple reason that it is impossible to have a serious deliberation or discussion about topics if you expect to have a negotiation about them 1 or 2 years from now. Because all that happens is the diplomats in Geneva anticipate what the negotiation is going to be like. And they don't want to say anything now which commits them 2 years from now. And that's the reality. And so the deliberation function has been quite seriously undermined by this practical reality. The third thing which has happened is, and the third example, and it's dear to my heart because I work in this area, is that during the crisis era, the WTO has set up a crisis monitoring or protections monitoring system which is very weak. And being very weak is the diplomatic way of putting it. And so much so that even the WTO Director General has acknowledged its deficiencies. When it comes to monitoring of protectionism, in the last round of monitoring, only 37% of WTO members actually submitted any information to this process. 63% just chose to ignore the process. That number is up from 35% the previous year. In other words, we have a sustained problem of non-cooperation. And quite frankly, a number of ambassadors in Geneva didn't want this monitoring to take place. After all, information is power, remember? They didn't want this information to be shared, and they didn't want the Secretariat doing it, and so they tried to starve the Secretariat of information. Now, what this has meant is that the initiative which I'm associated with, at least when we compare the G20 countries, we have found 44% more protectionist measures than the WTO, and we found 100% more liberalizing measures than the WTO. So we haven't just looked in one dimension for bad news. The simple fact is that the WTO is underperforming its monitoring function. Okay? And this is bad news for all of us, okay? Because information is a public good as well. So for these reasons, I would argue that the 3 major functions of the WTO are seriously underperforming. They're failing. Okay? They're failing. And it's the WTO's 20th birthday, we should be acknowledging these failures rather than hiding them. So that's the bottom line in terms of my assessment of their performance. Now, what I've just told you will upset, annoy a lot of people. And you will hear 3 arguments used to try and counter what I was saying. And let me just quickly go through. The first argument is going to be, look, all international organizations are dysfunctional at the moment. The WTO is no exception. Or the argument you'll hear is that multilateralism is having a tough time at the moment in a multipolar world. And so we shouldn't be unnecessarily critical of the WTO. This is a piece from the front page of The Economist where they made this point. What a way to run the world. A broken down UN system, a broken down World Bank and IMF, etc., etc. The problem with this argument is that it actually doesn't deny that the WTO is doing badly, it's just saying that everybody does badly. And we shouldn't be happy about that at all. Okay? And I would also ask the question, are we to believe that all of the WTO's faults are external to the trading system? I don't think so. Okay? So there will be some people who will try and deflect the argument by saying multilateralism is doing badly at the moment. No, that just says that other people are doing as badly, maybe worse, maybe less worse, but still the WTO is doing badly. The second argument you'll get this more from professors, less from officials, but occasionally you get the smart official who asks this question as well. And the question they'll say is, okay, so the WTO is doing badly, but it's better than having no WTO. To which I would ask the question, how could you know? How do we know what the world would look like in the absence of the WTO? What's your theory of how that looks? Have you got any data to back that up? Could we all agree that your view of the world in the absence of the WTO is right? And the answer is, once you get into those details, this clever debating point falls apart. Okay? Now, I mention this because many professors use this argument. And the problem is it doesn't help resolve the issue at all. It just muddies the issue. The third argument that you hear is, look, okay, the WTO's got some problems, but salvation is around the corner. Supply chains, global value chains, and outsourcing. A WTO which addresses these issues is a WTO which will succeed in the 21st century. There's been a lot of people charging after this particular argument. We've had even some of our friends at AMTAN have. Many of our friends at the OECD have, the World Bank have. Many development ministries have all chased this, many professors have as well. Okay? And what is interesting here is, I think, I'd make a number of points. I don't deny that supply chains and global value chains are important. As a commercial matter, they are. Okay? But what no one has done is answer this question here. Where is the fundamental change in the logic for, support for, scope of, and form of multilateral trade agreements? In other words, what are we actually going to do differently in Geneva if we're going to address supply chains? And I have been skeptical about this argument, these questions right from the start, and characteristically, or rather uncharacteristically, said nothing about this. And one of my friends, who was much more sympathetic to this idea, Bernard Hoekman, reviewed all of the issues on supply chains, and then asked the right question, which is, does it make a difference, any difference for the WTO? And after about 20 or 30 pages of long-winded, rambling text, the answer was no. Okay, no big change, right? And this is from someone who is perhaps one of the most sympathetic towards the idea. So I think what you'll get is some people saying, okay, look, the past has been not so good, but the future will be brighter, and they'll latch onto things like supply chains. And it's not convincing, because until they give us a convincing answer to this question here, things will not change. Now, it's interesting talking to ambassadors in Geneva. Their job, of course, is to ask this fourth question, this question again. They see straight through it, especially many developing country ambassadors. They see this as an attempt to try and shift the agenda and not in a direction which is necessarily they think in their interest. And more importantly, they just don't see what the WTO is supposed to do here. But I think they're right. So I think you're going to have reactions to what I've said, which are going to be, which will try and either change the subject or muddy the issue so much as to make the issue insoluble, unable to be resolved. So these are 3 points of warning as you listen to the debate on the WTO at age of 20. Let me come then to my overall assessment. My first key point is the WTO is failing in its core functions. That's not to say it's a complete failure, but I think it's failing, and I think it's got worse since 2007. Some of that is to do with the global economic crisis, but I think that the global economic crisis probably revealed problems which were already there, especially to do with monetary unification. Now, why has this happened, fundamentally? And it goes back to the beginning of my story. The world has changed. The WTO was created in the early 90s for a set of circumstances which are very unusual. The circumstances in the early 1990s were the Soviet Union had collapsed, communism had been discredited, free market capitalism, Western capitalism was seen as the only way of doing business, the emerging markets had not emerged, and Europe had not been seen to decline yet. So you ended up with an American set of ideas and a transatlantic partnership which looked very, very strong, which created the WTO in the form it is. The reality is that the world has moved on. Fundamentally has moved on, and if you want to keep the WTO has got to evolve as well. Now, at some level, it may have taken me almost an hour to make this point, but some of the leaders of the world have understood this for a certain amount of time. And let me give you an example. Now, what I'm about to say is very politically incorrect, okay? But it makes the point very, very well. The President of France, Charles de Gaulle, perhaps the most the biggest president of France in the post-war era, had a very nice way of putting this. Treaties are like roses and young girls. They last while they last. Okay? It's politically incorrect. You probably get fired at a US university if you were to say such things. But the point is, he questioned whether treaties last. The answer is not always. Okay? Not always. Okay? And the question is, the WTO we have is the WTO is suited certain interests in the early 1990s, but the question is, does it suit anybody now? And that takes us to the point that if the WTO is about negotiating binding accords, if that is the principal instrument, that's the principal thing you do at the WTO, and then you enforce those accords, who still wants to do that in policies that really count? Right? And this is where things like the TPP and others come in, because essentially the Americans are not doing this in Geneva where they know they will not get the support. They're trying to do this on strong-arm countries bilaterally to do this. Okay? And it will be interesting to see which of the major powers, including the Americans, will seriously change any of their major regulatory policies as part of these big deals. And one of the reasons why the European and American negotiation is going so badly is that both parties realize there's no willingness to do this. Okay? In which case, the WTO that we have is the WTO which was created in the early 1990s. It's not the WTO which we need today. The WTO we need today is one where governments don't want to bind. Lastly, what I've said about the WTO is pretty critical, but it comes from the perspective of someone who's very supportive of the principles of multilateral trade rules. And some people are going to be very upset by what I have said and what I will say this year during the 20-year celebrations. And I think what we're going to learn is that there are different types of friends of the WTO. There are some friends of the WTO who just tell you that everything's fine, don't worry. Okay? I'm not sure how useful that is. Secondly, there are some friends of the WTO who won't just tell you everything's fine. They will object to the criticisms that people like me and others have made on the grounds that we mustn't say these things because it will embolden the opponents, the real opponents to trade reform, and they will attack the WTO. So this is a tactical decision which I think is wrong. And thirdly, some will say that look, that we shouldn't talk about the WTO in negative terms because it'll just encourage prime ministers and presidents not to take the WTO seriously. Well, I have news to people who think like that. They don't take the WTO seriously anyway. If you want a really good example of this, go onto the web, look at the St. Petersburg G8 summit, in which there is a discussion between Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, and George Bush, the US President, about the Doha Round negotiations, and to see just how much contempt was shown about that negotiation between those two gentlemen, in particular on the American side. The simple fact is the Doha Round has discredited the negotiating function of the WTO for a while. And lastly, you can take the approach which I've taken, which is to acknowledge that there are problems and have a discussion about how to do things better. Okay? Because I think that we have a system which is better than no system, probably better than no system, but it has been oversold. It has supporters who cannot admit that it has mistakes, and I don't think this is healthy for the long run progress of the multilateral trade rules. What this means for younger people who are in trade ministries or people in ministries following WTO is that if you're in the business of following trade agreements, you'd better be in it for the long haul. You'll better be in it for the long haul because ultimately, given the way that these negotiations are played out over time, during your career you will probably be involved with two major global trade negotiations during a 40-year cycle. And so this is a system which does not move fast. If you're one of these people who needs to be a CEO or a minister by the age of 40, this is not the business to be in. Okay, this is really just not the business to be in. But it is an important business and it's a valuable business, and it takes a different mindset. And it's at times like this, on the 20th birthday of the WTO, that I think we should be reflecting on that system. Thank you very much. Any questions? Don't be shy. Oh, good.
Thank you for the very enlightening talk. I'm not really from the field, so this was a pleasure for me to learn a few things here. So my question is, for those friends of WTO who do acknowledge the problems and think about those solutions, what do you envision for this WTO of 21st century to be like? I mean, how should it function in the current situation to really address some of the issues that you highlighted? But plenty of them. So what do you see this new WTO, or the 21st century WTO to be relevant in current times?
I certainly see it as being very relevant because there's a huge amount of 21st century trade, which is the trade we saw in the 19th and 20th centuries. So even though the rules have not been updated in 20 years, they're still relevant for so much of that earlier trade. Trade in commodities, trade in manufactured goods, all of which are important for Malaysia. So I see an enormous relevance there still for the WTO. I do think there's in each of these functions we should ask, is there more that we can do? So let's start with the easiest area, in the area of notifications and deliberation. Is there a way in which we can encourage a greater flow of high quality information to the WTO, where it's understood that, okay, we may have disagreements about trade policy, but we are not going to mislead each other by what we're doing. That would have to be the implicit understanding between governments. It would mean giving up the right to be a little bit disingenuous in the supply of information or holding back information, but the gains, I think, overall would be substantial for everyone. Then when it comes to dispute settlement, there is a much more fundamental problem, and that is that cases in dispute settlement are brought by WTO members. And so long as cases are brought by WTO members and not by an independent adjudicator or prosecutor, then you're going to get the gains which I have described. There's going to be an inbuilt tendency for that to happen. So that might make you more cautious about enforcement of the rules. Then when it comes to negotiating new rules, I think we need to probably go back, at least for the time being, to the old idea that we try and codify as much of our existing reforms rather than use trade agreements to tear down trade barriers. So what that means for a lot of emerging markets is codifying their tariff cuts in manufacturing. What that means for Western countries is codifying a lot of their service sector reforms that they've been doing as well. So I suspect the object of those negotiations will change. What it means overall is a system which, given the countries are in such different places at the moment, is a system which is going to be less aggressive in terms of tough negotiations, use of law, enforcement, and much more a system where we recognise that it will only work if people want it to work. Okay, and that's important because there's a lot of language. There's a lot tied up in the language in the system. Well, so much of the system at the moment is described as a law-based system, a rules-based system. Okay, and that's different from having a system which fundamentally is based on a consensus that people want it to be. So there's a lot in how you think and how you do things at the WTO which might have to change. And as I said, for a whole generation of ambassadors and the like in Geneva, this is just out of their scope. This is beyond their comprehension, because they grew up during the last negotiation when it was all about what the WTO still is today. And that's going to be the shift. Now, this is where the time does matter, because some of the people here, if you're sticking around doing trade, eventually you'll end up in Geneva representing Malaysia, and you may be part of a change in guard as to how you think about it. But this current cohort of ambassadors, especially the ones who are from the hardcore liberalising group, they must find this just baffling.
So do you see this change happening organically, or is there a direct approach?
I think it will have to be organic. There may well be, at some point, it may get wrapped up into a nice initiative which can get written up in the press and everywhere. But what we have to do is for people to realise that there's a problem, and that the problem isn't that I'm perfect and everybody else just isn't taking the system seriously. It's that the system probably needs to evolve.
one last question. How do you see Malaysia fitting into this?
Well, this is a time precisely because we're moving to a system where we've got a small number of large players, and we also have a small number of medium-sized players who have often had a stake in the system, and Malaysia is one of them. And it's been interesting in the WTO in the last few years how some of the medium-sized players, like your Australias, like to a much lesser degree Switzerland, like Norway's, those types of countries have been able to have an impact in some, with often, not because they have huge amounts of negotiating clout, but often because they are seen as not being a big player, so they're not trying to push anyone around. And they have good ideas. They have good ideas, and they do their homework and try and understand what the other side wants and how to solve problems, rather than just accepting the rhetoric at face value. So I think there is a role for middle powers, and some countries will rise to it better than others. And I think if you think about where Malaysia is situated in its region and the experience you have within ASEAN, where you do have, even there, quite diverse views about what economic policy should be and what speeds can be good. I mean, you'd think that ASEAN members would be quite well suited to this new world, because they're quite used to understanding and dealing with differences, rather than trying to impose uniformity.
Okay, any other questions?
Two other questions, it seems.
So thank you again for that talk. I'm not from this field either, but I'm just a bit curious. There's a lot of talk about a global financial crisis that's coming. So could you speak a little bit about WTO's role, what it would be do in that kind of situation?
Okay. If I had to be absolutely frank with you, when I look at how the WTO performed at the last global financial crisis, I would say that governments early on made a choice, which was that they were going to prioritise financial market stabilisation and the reduction of unemployment over open borders. I think they made a choice. I think many governments made that choice. And if that assessment is correct, then an organisation which is designed to facilitate and promote open borders is going to do badly. And I think that's exactly what has happened. I've shown you the results of protectionism. Now the problem is, of course, no one wants to disown this system because they know in normal times that it's quite valuable. But it does leave the system, the WTO in particular, in a very bad spot. If during a period of time when governments are making very critical decisions, they are demoting the very priority of your organisation, which is keeping borders open, then how do you explain your role in existence? And that's the problem the WTO has faced here. Now, to be a bit more positive here, we've seen this before. In the early 1980s, there was a sharp global economic downturn. And there was a substantial rise of protectionism, which was monitored, I would argue, more effectively now by the GATT Secretariat, but more effectively then by the GATT Secretariat than the WTO Secretariat is doing now. And the outcome of this was that the empirical record built up so much protectionism that in 1982, the governments of the world came together and said, we recognise there's a problem. This time around, the situation's worse because we've gone around denying that there's a problem in the first place. Whereas the honest thing to do is to do what we did in 1982.
Next question.
I'm just very keen to ask for your opinion and your view about the TPP. Do you think there's a light at the end of the tunnels, or we are groping in the dark?
I think on TPP, the key issue is whether, we may not be telling you something we don't know, the key issue is whether the Americans and the Japanese can come to a deal. If they cannot, then the Japanese will be removed from the negotiation, and the Americans will force whatever deal they want on the other members of the TPP negotiations. So that's the outcome. I think the key fork in the road is whether or not the Americans believe that they can do a deal with the Japanese. At some point, the Americans may run out with the Japanese because this current administration in Washington wants to do the deal, and they only have they have less than 2 years left. Right? So at some point, they're going to make a decision about whether they can do this deal with the Japanese. I think you'll find if you look up on the web, the New Zealanders have already said if the Japanese are being difficult, let's get rid of them. Right? So the idea is already out there. Okay? By the way, don't be surprised if the Americans ask the New Zealanders to say that, but that's just speculation. Okay? And so I think I wouldn't be surprised if that decision has to get made at some point. And then if the Japanese are taken out of the negotiation, then the rest of the TPP negotiating partners will come under enormous pressure to conclude the deal during the remainder of the Obama administration. And then at that point, I think they will be told what to do. You don't negotiate a free trade agreement with the Americans. You're told what to do. If you feel like you're negotiating with the Americans are being polite towards you, that's the reality.
Okay, Professor Dr. Simon, we might want to cut the question and answer session now. So we move on to the next event. We will now have a preview on the Master of International Trade Program. I would like to invite Dr. Hassan Qaqaya, Head of Competition and Consumer Policy Branch, and Yang Berbahagia Professor Dato Dr. Sothi Rachangan, the Vice Chancellor of Perdana University, to deliver the preview presentation on the Master of International Trade Program. Please. We will now start the preview presentation of the Master of International Trade Program.